Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, brought to you as always by InsideThePenguins.com. I'm your host, Nick Brlansky, joined as always by Nick Horwat. Feeling not so refreshed after a couple days off. There are reasons for that, of course, because I was in Vegas and nobody can get rest in the city of Las Vegas. But we are back, ready to talk more about the Penguins general manager search, as it seems as if they are starting to wind down and potentially getting ready to find the next general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins here in the next couple of weeks. And then we're going to talk a little bit about blue bloods, Horwat. It's commonly a term used in college basketball, but we're going to bring that to the game of hockey and to the league of the NHL and talk a little bit about who the NHL's blue bloods could be. But let's start with the Penguins general manager search, because this could be a massive week in regards to the actual general manager position for the Pittsburgh Penguins. It seems like more and more stuff are beginning to get released from different sources, whether that's TSN, whether that's Sportsnet, whether that's The Athletic. We're seeing a lot of news being reported about who's being interviewed, what round of interviews they are in, and how this process is beginning to play out for the Penguins.
Yeah, this could be the week. I know all of the sources are saying that the first round of interviews is over. Names have been released. Some names have not been released. The list is a wide. Fenway said at the beginning they're going to cast a wide net, and some of the names we've seen come from what feels like all walks of life, all walks of styles of hockey, all walks of building a team in many different forms and managing a team in many different forms. It's going to be an interesting week. Each and every name has can bring their own their own sense of passion and their own build to this Penguins team. It'll be interesting to see where things go from here. From what it sounds, though, there aren't names totally. There aren't definite names yet either. Like there aren't definite, finals in the running or whatever it may be. It's this is going to still be a process, but it might get wrapped up this week. It's going to be interesting, and then of course the big fish took himself out.
Yeah, and we'll get to Kyle Dubas here in a few minutes as he basically relieves himself from any other duty except for the Toronto Maple Leafs, if that is what the Leafs end up doing after they get eliminated from the playoffs in the second round. But here's what we know as of now. The Penguins are looking to hire both a general manager and a president of hockey ops. That is from Frank Saravalli of the Daily Faceoff. That is something that we saw with the Hextall and Burke era for the first time in the history of the Pittsburgh Penguins, and something that Fenway Sports Group apparently liked the way the workflow worked, just not with those two in charge. The results weren't what they had hoped for. So it looks like the Penguins are looking to have a similar situation, hiring both one general manager and one president of hockey ops. They wanted to interview 10 to 12 candidates in their first round, all via Zoom. Some of the names included in that were Eric Tulsky, Jason Karmanos, former general manager and friend of Mario Lemieux, Mark Bergevin, who former general manager of the Canadiens, I should specify there, and another former general manager, this time of the Edmonton Oilers, Peter Chiarelli. That's from Pierre LeBrun. The interesting thing there is we had heard mostly, I would say we heard upwards of 20 names. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they ended up only wanting to interview around 10 to 12 candidates tells me they had a really extensive first portion. And while, yes, the first round of interviews was 10 to 12 people, that tells me that this is clearly not the first leg of their search. This is probably leg 3 or 4 of their search that they got to before they even interviewed a single candidate.
Yeah, I mean, just the names that you listed off don't even scratch the surface of the rest of the names that have been discussed, rumored, talked about. Like it's, there's still more to it. I mean, like I said, those are some names. That's a wide variety of names, and yet the variety continues to get wider. We discussed on this podcast already certain ones from before that, good ideas to go after, and then the must avoids, i.e. Stan Bowman. I mean, there are names that we've discussed that have been put out there that we would even go, yeah, let's not talk to him. Well, let's talk about why we shouldn't talk to him. It's a wide range. It's a wide range, and it's can't wait to hear people's reactions to the rest of the names that we are going to bring up here, because there's some interesting ones left.
Yeah, some other names that we've seen over the weekend get thrown out there. This is by Frank Saravalli, again, of the Daily Faceoff. Matthew Darsh, former Penguins AGM and current Seattle Kraken AGM Jason Botterill, former Arizona Coyotes general manager John Chaika, who left unceremoniously from his post there, and also Ryan Martin. So it seems like we are finally starting to get more and more clarity, and it's coming faster and faster on the Penguins general manager front, as it seems as if they're starting to expedite the process, starting to get through the process of narrowing down the search. But some of these names, like you mentioned, are coming out of nowhere. John Chaika is not a name that I heard up until I saw that from Frank Saravalli. Like, I didn't even see that as a potential name from anybody, of course, from any of the major markets, or not markets, but any of the major publications.
Yeah, no, that's a totally new name. It's a bit out of left field, but I'm sure the departure was a little unceremonious, but I need to look back into the finer details of it all, because I don't totally hate the candidacy of him, specifically John Chaika. Again, like I said, I need to look back into everything. It's not like what he did, from what I can remember and recall, it's not like he wasn't trying to give his team a competitive advantage.
Yeah, he was just doing it illegally.
Yeah, he was trying to do what he could to help his team win. And quite honestly, sometimes if you're not cheating, you're not trying. But that being said, that's not the kind of face you want in your front office. But if he's got the passion to help your team win, that's already a step above Ron Hextall. And another thing, too, is two more names that Saravalli threw out on his most recent rundown. One was Cam Lawrence from the Columbus Blue Jackets, who I know nothing about. And he said that he hasn't been able to confirm if anyone's talks to him, but a name that is interesting and a name that hasn't been talked about enough, Sam Ventura, former Penguins front office face and from the area, and would fit the role of FSG wanting to go in an analytical direction.
Yeah, currently a member of the Buffalo Sabres front office is Sam Ventura, and a name that, you know, we mentioned early on. I know when we had our show with Doug and with Hunter of Locked On Penguins, we stated that, you know, Sam Ventura is a name that, if it was anywhere but Pittsburgh that had an opening, probably wouldn't be brought up. But it was Pittsburgh that had an opening, and we had already heard that FSG wanted to go in an analytical approach, and Sam Ventura was one of the foremost players in that game when it comes to the Pittsburgh Penguins moving towards an analytical approach. So it would be interesting to see whether or not he gets one of those Zoom calls that were the first round of interviews, and if he's able to move on alongside a lot of these names that are people that have formerly been general managers, or somebody that was a current general manager but is no longer in the fold. But before we get to that, Horwat, are you somebody who, because you said if you're not cheating, you're not trying, are you somebody that believes that, honestly, it's not illegal until you get caught?
I mean, let's ask Barry Bonds about that. Let's ask any MLB player from the 90s. No, even if you're still doing it, it is still cheating. It's just no one knows about it. There's the difference. And obviously just what Arizona was doing was a little more obvious than
I mean, Vancouver also just got slapped on the wrist for that. They did the same exact thing, working out players from the draft illegally, like prospects illegally and stuff like that, outside of the purview of what's normally fair across the NHL and certain standards that are set. So yes, it's not as bad as some of the candidates have done, but it is certainly something that is a black mark on John Chaika's record. But let's talk a little bit about Kyle Dubas, because it's probably the last time we're going to talk about him. And I know he was the belle of the ball for you, Horwat. He was your favorite to land this position, or at least one of your favorites to land this position. But as of yesterday and his exit press conference with the Toronto Maple Leafs media, Kyle Dubas has taken himself out of the running for any general manager position that is not the Toronto Maple Leafs. Basically stated it's the Leafs or nothing, because if he does not get re-upped with the Toronto Maple Leafs, which I do genuinely believe that he probably will be. I think he saved his job by the desperation he showed at the trade deadline. Most of those moves panning out and winning a playoff series for the first time since 2004, showed in the second round against Florida. But I think that's as much to do with Florida as it is to do with the Toronto Maple Leafs, as well as the fact that they lost their goaltender. I genuinely believe that he's going to end up back in Toronto, but we definitely know for sure that he will not end up in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, we can say he won't end up in Pittsburgh. And listen, I don't want to turn this into a Leafs podcast, but I'm of the opinion that genuinely that means Kyle Dubas shouldn't be working next season. It's what I believe. I went over this whole conversation with Megan yesterday. Listen, the Leafs need change. They need to change three things. That is their head coach, one of the core four, and Kyle Dubas. It just needs to happen. The definition of insanity we talked about on this podcast last summer for the Penguins is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. They won a round. You can't say that's good enough.
Yeah.
That's the thing. You won a round. That is great. That is good. You did defeat, I'm not even going to say you defeated one of your boogeymen, but you defeated a pretty good team in the Tampa Bay Lightning.
I'll say they're the NHL's boogeyman, but yes.
Yes. They'll give them that. But it's the way they lost in round 2 that completely defeated the purpose. And sure, Dubas did go all in at the deadline, but also you had to, not that it wasn't an awesome thing to see, but you had to work with multiple e-bugs down the stretch because you're stuck in cap hell. How'd you get there? Oh, yeah, because you're paying 4 people $11 million each. Sorry, 11, 11, 10, 10. I don't know. But that being said, I'm of the opinion that Dubas, if he's not working outside of Toronto next season, then he probably shouldn't be working at all then, because Toronto needs change. And the fact that he's not coming to Pittsburgh hurts. But, I need to take the blinders off of Kyle Dubas for myself, I guess. I need to look at what other options are out there. And, it's okay to be attracted by the big fish in the sea. And especially in this situation, you want what's best for the Penguins. And it probably would have been Dubas. He checked all the boxes that this team needs. But if he needs his time off, he needs his time off. And there's such a list of other options that you have to hope that they find the right guy anyway.
Yeah, I know you had an attachment to Kyle Dubas, and whether he goes back to Toronto or not is immaterial for this podcast because we don't cover the Toronto Maple Leafs. But as far as him not coming to the city of Pittsburgh and not becoming the Pittsburgh Penguins general manager, it certainly felt like if he wanted the job was his. And it certainly also felt like he might have wanted the job at one point, but the way something, worked out in the playoffs, it's going to be Toronto or bust. And now we'll never actually know if he genuinely wanted to come to the Pittsburgh Penguins to be the new general manager. So he's out. That leaves all the names we already mentioned that have been mentioned as far as being potential players that have been interviewed and general manager candidates that have been interviewed. And Eric Tulsky, Jason Karmanos, Mark Bergevin, Peter Chiarelli. Stan Bowman's name hasn't been thrown out there again, but he has been mentioned several times as we've talked about, so we won't get back into that. Jason Botterill, John Chaika, Ryan Martin, also names that have been mentioned. The last thing we want to say before we move over and talk about NHL's Blue Bloods and whether or not the Pittsburgh Penguins are one of them, which is going to be a fun conversation. I think I'm excited to have that one. I would imagine you do not see much in this process in terms of news surrounding the next president of hockey ops for the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's similar to when Brian Burke was hired in my eyes, because nobody at that point, I get it was different because it was the first time the Pens had ever gone in that direction. So the thought of a different general manager and president of hockey ops is one thing, but I really do think that you're not going to see very much news until you see a name just immediately hired.
Yeah, most likely. It's the exact way it went last time. And for the sake of last time too, I mean, they had to do a quick turnover when it came to those hires because it was the middle of the season. They had to put someone in charge pretty quickly. It was just a different era. Whereas now we've already been without multiple faces in the front office for over a month now. So The turnover hasn't been as quick. Obviously, we've had the time to search, but I think a lot of the same thing. I think maybe one of these names that we're just hearing discussed as part of the interviews might slip into the role, but it's not going to be the obvious. This person is interviewing for this position. That's what we're hearing. I mean, we could take these names and go, this person might be better in this role. This person might be better in that role, but that's, again, just us assuming and wanting to see what could work out best for the Penguins.
Yeah, whenever I look at that, obviously, I feel like if it is one of the things that you mentioned that, hey, they're interviewing one of these candidates for the general manager position and might offer them the hockey ops position, a name that comes up there, and we don't have to dive into it deeply. Stan Bowman would be somebody that I would expect would fit that bill, right?
Yeah.
I would say Stan Bowman. I would say probably Mark Bergevin. I would say any of these guys that had been general managers before.
Yeah.
I would say probably fits the bill as somebody that could come in and play a role as president of hockey ops, similar to what Brian Burke was. Because remember, Burke, of course, was the general manager of several teams before he came to the Penguins. And he was also a president of hockey ops before he came to the Penguins as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was that. But again, it seems as if most of the news, most of the headlines are going to be generated towards the general manager search, and they're not going to, complete that search and then go through a different search for president of hockey ops. I think these are two positions that are being very closely monitored together, not just separately as if there was two entirely different situations.
Yeah, that's we're just going to see the names. And then maybe it's a new name that appears out of nowhere, and that's the president. And yeah, you're right. The GMs that we're interviewing make more sense to be promoted, if you will, to be a president. Which the thing about the president of hockey operations in Pittsburgh is we've only had one, and the entire time we had no idea what he did here.
Yeah.
So we can't really speak on what they do. They have the ability to nix trade proposals. Well, Brian Burke didn't seem to do that. Either that, or he was perfectly okay with Mikael Granlund, or he's perfectly okay with Jeff Petrie, and yet he wanted the team to be bigger and stronger. And there we were getting pushed around all season.
Yeah, and like we mentioned earlier, the Pittsburgh Penguins are trying to get, quote, clarity this week on the search, according to Elliot Friedman of 32 Thoughts. I personally don't think it gets done this week, but I think clarity means we see almost the full list of candidates that are still in the running or potentially some of the front runners for the position.
Yeah, I think what's real fun is that because it's the playoffs, teams not in the postseason make their news in the morning because they have to. It'll be real fun to see if they make an announcement while we're recording. So do it on a Tuesday or Thursday, boys. Make that higher while we're here, because that could be great entertainment for us.
Honestly, preferably, I would like you to do it on a Monday or a Wednesday. That way I have a little bit of time to think. But, who needs thinking, right?
Gut reactions are what's best for this show.
Reactions are more fun anyway. And instant reactions are what makes cold takes, and that's what I specialize in, Horwat. Let's get into some more cold takes after the break as we discuss who the NHL's Blue Bloods are. We'll get to that on Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Welcome back to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, brought to you as always by InsideThePenguins.com. I'm Nick Horwat. That's Nick Brlansky. I don't know. I'm a little off balance today, Horwat. I already mentioned I just got back from Vegas. My lighting crapped out in the middle of that segment, and it looked like I was a supervillain sitting here. And, we're going to talk about the NHL's Blue Bloods. I'm excited about this because I think it's a fun segment. I think it's an interesting exercise, but I need to get my head screwed on straight because I've had a couple days off, and I need to step my game up. That's all.
You're doing great. It's just the first day back. There's nothing much more you can do. It's been a slow week, but also it's going to be a slow week, but also a very busy week. So
I will say this. After the long travel home, because my travel home was a hellscape, I never want to be in LAX ever again. That's all I'll say.
You had to go backwards? Ooh.
I had to go backwards. I dislike that airport now, simply because I had to spend about 6.5 hours in it. But let's discuss who the NHL's blue bloods are. As I said early in the show, the term blue blood is commonly used for college basketball. And when you look at college basketball, the blue bloods are Kentucky, Kansas, Duke, UNC, Villanova. And then some people put UConn, who are currently the defending national champions, in that basket. Some people decide not to put UConn in there. But the point is, there's only a handful. There's how many teams in college basketball? 180, over 200. I don't even know, because there's plenty of them, obviously, but only about a handful, 5 or 6, that are considered blue bloods. And what does that mean? That means those are the teams that commonly are better in the league and are often not held down. Now, in a situation like college basketball, it's a little bit easier to become a blue blood because it's all on, hey, do you want to come play for Kentucky versus do you want to come play for Appalachian State? And most people are going to say, I'm going to go to Kentucky. So they get the better talent. Doesn't quite work like that in a professional sport. But I would say there are blue bloods in the National Hockey League. And I would certainly say that there's already one that's been baked into the league based on the way the history goes with the original 6. I don't think you can take any of those 6, despite the fact that Chicago's been bad for a couple seasons. Detroit's been bad for almost a decade. Toronto just won their first playoff series since 2004. Montreal, they've struggled for the better part of the past decade. The New York Rangers have won 1 Stanley Cup in the past 60, 70 years. I would say the original 6 is the basis of the blue bloods in the NHL.
Without doubt. It's those 6 teams for sure. And it's mostly because of the history. It's not at all the what have you done for me lately category. You got New York, one of the biggest markets in the league, set and done. Montreal, the most storied history of the league, set and done. Toronto, probably the biggest moneymaker in the league right now, set and done. I mean, if anyone was to fall off the list, I'd probably shoot Detroit. But even then, they got the history. They've had Mr. Hockey.
Yeah.
And the history is there. Chicago, you could also offer up, but this is also a league that loves markets. And Chicago is a huge market.
Oh, yeah.
So there's really no one you could take off of the original 6 as in this category. So all 6 of them stay for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with Detroit, as you mentioned, yes, they've been bad for the longest of times right now because they had seemingly haven't been good since they lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins in 2009 in the Stanley Cup Finals. I know they had a couple better years after that, but they really haven't been a serious threat or serious contender for about a decade in the NHL. But I think when I look at this conversation, I look at blue bloods. Yes, Detroit, they had Mr. Hockey. They were an original 6 team. They had, I believe it was the 50s that they were winning Stanley Cups left and right. But they also had those teams in the 90s that were just as good, and some believe some of the best teams in the history of the NHL, led by Steve Yzerman, led by Nick Lidstrom. Remember when the Penguins played the Red Wings in 2008, and they ended up losing in 6. That Red Wings team had so many Hockey Hall of Famers because that's just who the Red Wings were, as I punch my microphone. So I would say that there's not really a case to be made to take any of these teams out. Like, I know Chicago didn't win for the longest time, and then they had the Kane Taves era come and go, and they won 3 Stanley Cups in 5 seasons or 5 years. And yes, that is what it is. But when you come into the NHL, and even as an outside observer of the NHL, you know of the original 6, and you can probably place which teams are in the original 6 and why those are the biggest names in hockey.
Yeah, you can. It's a combination of history, market size, and success, really. Those are the big reasons there. It's why they are there. And I think market size, because it's the NHL and it is still a league that wants to grow their game so much. Mm-hmm. Market, I do think, plays a huge role in who the league would categorize as blue bloods, at least.
Well, The league itself would categorize anybody that makes them the most money as a blue blood, because that's the team they're going to try to showcase on national television more often than not.
That's exactly right.
And it's what we see there. And with that becomes the interesting conversation. Would you add the Penguins to that list? Would you make them the 7th blue blood in the National Hockey League?
You know what? I think so. I think, I know what I just said. I know what I just said about market size, but also history is a huge part of what the NHL loves to rely on. And I mean, since 1984, you could argue the Penguins have had the best player in the league. That's almost 30, 40 years of dominance. I mean, sure, we haven't had dominance for all 40 years. We've been to the mountaintop, we've been to the cellar, we've seen it all in that span. But you can make the argument that it's there. I mean, beyond, I forget what the number is. Don't we have isn't 5 cups outside of the original 6 tied for the most?
It is. It is tied with Edmonton for the most Stanley Cup championships outside of the original 6, and more than
I'd
have to look back, more than the Rangers.
Oh, sure. I believe so too. But yes.
I'll look that up, but yeah, go continue.
So I would say because of the success in such a short amount of time, you put the Penguins up there because of their reign with Mario Lemieux, because of the times with Jaromir Jagr, and then feeding that into the Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin era, not to mention 16 consecutive postseason appearances in these past 2 decades. It's definitely something that puts the Penguins on that pedestal. Mm-hmm. And if you want to argue to take them off, I could see your argument as well, but I just believe they are absolutely a part of it.
Yeah, the Pittsburgh Penguins do indeed obviously have more Stanley Cups than the New York Rangers. The Rangers have 4, the Penguins have 5. And also, the Pittsburgh Penguins have won 5 in 6 Stanley Cup Finals appearances, whereas the Edmonton Oilers have 5 in 7. So another little asterisk there that leads towards the Pittsburgh Penguins. But I think the big thing that you mentioned there was they've had one of, if not the league's biggest star, play under their logo for the last 40 seasons. And they've been a team for, 55, 56 seasons? So 40 of 56 seasons, they had one of the league's most marketable superstars on their roster. And not just one, right? You see all the other names that have been to Pittsburgh and played for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Evgeny Malkin, obviously. Marc-Andre Fleury, obviously. Go back a little bit further. You had Jaromir Jagr, Ron Francis, Rick Tocchet, all of these names that are synonymous in hockey history with success. They played for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Mark Recchi's another name that has to be brought up, a guy that has won Stanley Cups in 3 different cities. He did so in Pittsburgh in his rookie year back in 1991. So the Pittsburgh Penguins have a history of winning. And also, you mentioned it, money is important because being a blue blood means that you're always in the nation's forefront. You're always in the national spotlight. You're always in the national eye. And the Pittsburgh Penguins are often in that spotlight. We always say it every year. Once February is over, almost every other Pittsburgh Penguins game is on national television. How many times have the Pittsburgh Penguins played outdoor games in a big national spot where the league needs to bring in revenue, needs to bring eyes to the product? It's the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, is that because of the Penguins or because of Sidney Crosby? It's because of Sidney Crosby. But considering the fact that this team has won Stanley Cups in multiple different decades and multiple different dynasties and multiple different eras, they are one of the most important, if not the most important, non-original 6 franchise to the National Hockey League, and they are certainly deserving of the title of a blue blood in my eyes.
No, yeah, absolutely. It's the history that's there. It's the faces that have been there. It's the success. You didn't even mention guys like Larry Murphy, Paul Coffey on the blue line, Tom Barrasso in the net, and names have filtered through even in their short periods of time too. We've had faces, we've had names, and then we've had success. It's all the more reason why this team should be talked about in that kind of discussion and in the national eye ever since Lemieux got here.
The other 2 teams that are in a similar situation to the Pittsburgh Penguins, one that we've already mentioned here in this conversation is Edmonton. The Edmonton Oilers, of course, were the home and the draft place of Wayne Gretzky, one of the greatest of all time, arguably the greatest of all time. We would argue against that personally. But they won 5 Stanley Cups, all in the 80s and one in 1990. And now they have who is considered to be the best player in hockey in Connor McDavid. Although they once again fell in the second round of the postseason. Would you consider Edmonton a blue blood?
I would say yes. And just as I was about to say yes, I remembered they're a WHA team. They came from the WHA, and not that the NHL, really cares that much. I mean,
anymore.
Edmonton is, anymore. But thinking of the history of the league, they weren't originally an NHL team. So I'm going to still say yes, but they might be one of the lower ones, ironically, despite having Wayne Gretzky, despite having 5 cups, and despite winning a cup without Gretzky, which really says something. It doesn't get talked about enough in the lore of Edmonton. And then bringing in McDavid all these years later, finally hitting on that draft pick, if you will. I think a lot of people scoff at the idea of Edmonton as well because they have been given all of the opportunity to reclaim what they were and haven't done it. Not that they haven't tried. I mean, Connor McDavid is there now, but I mean, all those first round picks, all those first overall picks that didn't pan out. It leaves a bit more of a stain on their legacy, but at the end of the day, I would say they squeeze into the conversation. Yes.
I would agree with that. I think when you see the Edmonton Oilers perform well, you see the league succeed, right? Yeah. Especially because they have Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. They got to the second round of the playoffs. That is one of, if not, it is one of the most raucous hockey fan bases in the world, right? Toronto's up there. Edmonton is up there. Probably the two-headed monster of Canada right now because Montreal has struggled the past couple seasons. And when Montreal is good, they're right up there as well. But Edmonton, their success matched with their future as well, I think has to put them in there. And I understand the WHA angle, but I think that is faded to this point, as you mentioned. And really, it's tough because 8 blue bloods in a 32-team league, like a quarter of the league being blue bloods, is tough. But it really does happen because the NHL has 6 already baked in. Like, you can't take out any original 6 members. And then I would add the Penguins and Oilers. Tampa's another name that could be interesting, but I don't quite think that they're there yet because they are still such a new franchise, relatively speaking, compared to the Edmonton Oilers, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and certainly the original 6. But Tampa's recent run might be why they get into that conversation in the first place.
So, we're discussing the idea of 8 blue bloods. Hell, I'm throwing a 9th and maybe a 10th in if the conversation gets there. But you also have to look at other leagues that might have a similar situation. I mean, how many are there in baseball? There's only 30 teams yet. Every large market there could be considered. You're talking the Yankees, you're talking the Dodgers immediately. You're talking the Cubs for that history immediately.
And probably the Red Sox.
Probably the Red Sox. Probably the Phillies, if you really wanted to.
I would say that's it.
I was going to say the Pirates, too, just because of that. I mean, they started in 1887. Clemente went through. They are one of the most historical teams in the MLB, but that's it. That's where it ends. History. So there's a ton of teams in every sport. I mean, that even goes into like football. I mean, 32 teams there. I mean, which team isn't a blue blood, really? So,
well, I think
because they're all cash cows. In the
NFL. In the NFL, every team makes an absorbent amount of money, but I think that you really have a core group of teams that the league would love to see be the final 4 or 5 teams every single season. That's Pittsburgh, that's Dallas, that's Green Bay, that's the Raiders, although they're in Vegas now, so I don't know how that shapes out because the Oakland Raiders were, one of the best fan bases in the National Football League and certainly one of the most historic. And I'm missing one, the Patriots.
You would toss the Patriots in there. You could probably toss the Giants in there if you wanted to because of the market.
But again, that's when we get into like the Penguins in hockey and the Oilers in hockey. Like that's That's when you get outside of the core, which the core is the 6 in the NHL, the original 6. I would say it ends with the Penguins and the Oilers. And I would say there is a question to be had, and you could argue either way for me in either of those positions. You could say, you know what, it's the original 6 and that's it.
Yeah.
And I would say, you know what, I get that, I understand that, and it makes sense. It's the one that's literally baked into the pie. But the way the Penguins have really dominated in the sense that, not that they've dominated play, but dominated in the sense that they have always been part of the story. Whatever the season story is for the NHL, the Penguins have been a part of it for the past 40 seasons.
Yeah.
A lot of that's due to the players that they've had on the ice. Some of that's due to the fact that their organization, for the most part, has been run extremely well and has been run as one of the top organizations in the National Hockey League. But I would say that they are, personally, in that conversation. Now, if you disagree, let us know in the comments. Let us know in the review area of whether that's Apple Podcasts. I don't believe you can do it on Spotify. You can just leave a 5-star review and we'll be the end of that. But just let us know wherever we are. Obviously on Twitter at Ice-Burgh Podcast. Are the Pittsburgh Penguins a blue blood? We both say yes. Let us know your opinion. But let's also talk really quickly about Tampa. I think they're too new. But I do think that they're a team that is on the cusp of, if they can continue, obviously, being one of the blue bloods, because they found fairly early success in the Vinny LeCavalier and Marty St. Louis era. And now you see them as probably one of the most dominant teams of the modern era over the past 3-4 seasons, because even this season, they were extremely talented and extremely good and an extremely hard out for the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah, it's, I would say they are getting there. They are also stuck with the handicap of a non-traditional hockey market.
That's yeah.
And that, let's be real, that is what pulls them down. I mean, the Dallas Stars have won a cup, and they had Mike Modano and a few other all-time greats filter through their city, yet we haven't said their name once. The LA Kings won a couple of cups and had Wayne Gretzky, yet we don't discuss them in this conversation. It's not easy to build that sort of reputation in that sort of market. It hurts them, but also the fact that they are able to build up this sort of, resume in that market, it's a good chip on their shoulder to have. And why they are still so close yet, I would toss 2 more names in there, and it doesn't involve them.
Okay. I would say there's another name for me that comes up when I think of this, but both the Tampa Bay Lightning and this other name who we'll talk about in a bit are teams that I could see potentially becoming a blue blood one day. Like in the future, I would say you need another 10, maybe 20 years to be considered a blue blood. Like that might be ridiculous, but it feels like you need to have the history and you need to be able to show success over a long period of time. That doesn't mean you never miss the playoffs. That doesn't mean you are never under 500. That just means when you are, it doesn't last very long.
Yeah, I would say they are right on the cusp of it too. I mean, because you figure you're throwing the Penguins in there because they were able to have success over multiple waves of stars. The Lightning had their first wave, got a cup out of it, and they're on to their second wave now. And they've gotten 2 out of it and went a third time. So they're right there. I wouldn't say 20 years. I wouldn't even say 10. I'd say in a handful, they could probably achieve that status if they're able to have their stars go out gracefully.
Yeah, and then replace them.
Yeah, exactly. They don't even have to replace them and be good. I mean, just have a decent team following that, and then, you're in that conversation.
Yeah, you mentioned 2 other teams.
I'm going to throw them out there. You totally don't have to agree, but a lot of it, in my eyes, comes down to the history and the market size, and that is the New York Islanders and the Philadelphia Flyers. The Islanders got those 4 cups, the history there, some of the greats. If Mike Bossy wasn't injured, we'd be having a whole different discussion about Mike Bossy and his life. And the Flyers, I get their rivals, and only with 2 Stanley Cups from the 70s. But that market is massive. That fan base is massive. That team is important to the league. Whether they're good or bad, they're always talked about. And they have such a history from the 70s of being more than just an NHL team. They played the Red Army, guys. Just that in itself, I think they're in there. I think you could definitely say they're not, and I understand the argument, but I'd say you throw them in there. And also, more blue bloods in the league, I think, is a good thing. That just means there's some popularity there.
Yeah, you mentioned in the NFL, most of the teams are blue bloods at this point. Like, you can make the argument for most of the teams, except for maybe like
the Texans,
the Jacksonville Jets, the AFC South.
Yeah,
the AFC South outside of the Indianapolis Colts because they had Peyton Manning.
And they're also up north, which is the wildest thing.
Well, yeah, welcome to geography via sports. It doesn't make sense ever. But no, when it comes to the Islanders and Flyers, I would personally disagree. I get the point you're trying to make because they are important franchises to the league, and you could be an important franchise to the league and not be considered a blue blood. It's a very arbitrary thing when it comes to taking it outside of college basketball because it's so obvious in college basketball because of the way the landscape is. But when it comes to the Islanders and Flyers, I just think they've had bouts of really irrelevance that would take them out for me. Personally, for me, I think they've been irrelevant for too long, for too many stretches to be considered a blue blood, where the Pittsburgh Penguins, even when they sucked, weren't really irrelevant, right? Because they still had the shadowy figure of Mario Lemieux somewhere in the background. They also had the threat of moving somewhere in the background. And some people could say, yeah, that's a negative. How are you a blue blood if you're threatening to move? Because that franchise and the players in it and just the entirety of that situation was so important that they were not going to let it sit there and rot, right? The Arizona Coyotes, sorry to Arizona Coyotes fans, they have sat in that market for far longer than they probably should have. Now, does that mean it won't work in the future? No, it does not mean it won't work. Does it mean that I'm not rooting for them? No, because I'd like to see the Arizona Coyotes succeed because hockey in the desert, as we've seen in Vegas, can be successful.
Yeah.
But that franchise is not as important to the league, which is why the league's like, yeah, we'll give you more time to try to figure it out there instead of moving you because we need you to produce. Whereas the Penguins, they were like, listen, we need something. Like, we need something. We might move them if they don't find something.
We need something. Let's rig a draft lottery for you.
Yeah, there's that, right?
Oh, who said it? Who said that?
Yeah, and that happens for blue bloods all the time. 2023 being an example. No, just kidding. But no, it's very arbitrary conversation. It's very opinionated conversation, and we want to hear your opinions, and we'll talk about it on Thursday. Maybe at the end of the show, in lieu of a Pens poll, we'll just say, who does everybody believe are the blue bloods for the National Hockey League? Maybe we'll put out a tweet, but if we don't put out a tweet, just comment under this video or let us know on Twitter at Ice-Burgh Podcast. We're on Facebook at Tip of the Ice-Burgh Podcast. We're on Instagram as well, although less active on there as we are on Facebook and on Twitter. But I think the reason this got brought up for me, the reason I thought about this was because I look at the conference finals. I'm like, this is interesting. Yeah. Because there's no blue bloods left. Like Carolina, Florida in the Eastern Conference Finals is not what I had on my bingo card, right? I don't think many people did. And Dallas, Vegas, while, hey, those are two pretty large markets when you just look at media markets in general. But is Dallas ever going to be able to compete with the Cowboys? No. Are the Stars ever going to be able to compete with even the Mavericks right now? The circus show that are the Dallas Mavericks. Can the Stars compete with that? Maybe down there. I don't know. Listen, I've never been in that market. I don't know the market share when it comes to sports. I just feels like the Stars just aren't a team. And the market, like you said, non-traditional hockey market down south, they're not a team that's going to be able to break through that, even though they had a star like Mike Modano, even though they had a Bobby Hall, I believe.
Brett Hall, yes.
Brett Hall. That's I always mix up the freaking Halls. And also Marty Turco, because I loved Marty Turco when he was playing there. But Vegas, similar to Tampa, I think Vegas could be. Vegas could in the future be considered a blue blood for the National Hockey League because of the importance of their city, right? It is a massive city that everybody will flock to. Everybody will flock to Vegas, and they've immediately found success. I mean, 4 conference finals in their first 6 years of existence. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, they might be the big heel of the league. I think I think that term's kind of faded for them a little bit. Last season, the season before, they were definitely the heels of the league after, starting out as baby faces. But I think they just kind of centered into just a hockey team, just a very good hockey team who right off the jump has had immediate success. If they can maintain this sort of not pace of success, but if they can still hold on to this level of winning and just having good teams and good players, they're the team that would need the 20 years because they're still that new.
Yeah.
If not even 30, if you want to push it. Yeah, absolutely. If they're able to maintain some sort of pace like this, maybe win a cup or two over the next 20 years, absolutely. They're in this discussion as well.
And here's the thing about Vegas that I don't think you can say about pretty much any other franchise. Like, I'd even have to look at the original 6. I don't think any of those franchises outside of Toronto, Montreal, any other real franchise that has other sports, Vegas is going to have the bigger fan base over the Las Vegas Raiders, I would think, locally. That's not transferred because remember, they're starting from scratch as the Golden Knights. The Raiders brought over one of the biggest fan bases in football, right? Like you ask LA fans, like anybody in LA, they like the Raiders more than they like the Rams or the Chargers.
That's hilarious.
So I would say that locally they have a stronger fan base than the Raiders, and they're certainly going to have a stronger fan base than the A's. So they are number 1 in Vegas.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at a lot of these other teams, Pittsburgh, they're not number 1 in Pittsburgh. The Penguins are not number 1 in Pittsburgh. The Steelers are. Boston, the Bruins are not number 1. Celtics are up, I think, close to them. The Patriots are certainly up there, and the Red Sox are probably number 1 in Boston. Yeah. Chicago, same thing. It's the Cubs, it's the Bulls, then it's the Blackhawks. New York Rangers, is anybody ever going to touch the New York Yankees? No. Right? And if it's not the Yankees, the Mets are even up there, right? The
Mets are up there.
The Mets are up there. The Knicks are up there as well. And even the Nets now are starting to grow a fan base and starting to grow importance because they've been a circus show for the past 5 seasons or since they moved to Brooklyn, really. So, yeah, outside of Toronto, Montreal, any of the real Canadian franchises that don't have to fight with other sports, unless you consider the CFL something that could even take a bite out of the apple there, the Vegas Golden Knights have that advantage over every other, at least U.S.-based franchise that has to go head-to-head with another sport.
Yeah. Yeah, Vegas is up there. They've got that opportunity. It's going to take a long time to get there, but they've got the opportunity.
So that's my list. I would add Edmonton in there personally. I'd have 8. It would be the original 6, the Penguins in Edmonton.
Mm-hmm.
That's who I would have as my Blue Bloods for the NHL.
Yeah, and I have my 10, so I'll hold on to my 10.
So yours is the original 6, the Penguins, the Oilers. You would add Philly and the Islanders as well.
Yeah, something about his hockey history that you can't have the discussion without those 2 teams.
All righty. I mean, hey, it's a very opinionated thing. That's why I wanted to bring it up because I wouldn't necessarily put the Flyers or the Islanders in there. Some people wouldn't put the Penguins or the Oilers in there.
Some people might throw every Canadian team in there because it's hockey and it is Canada. And you could see the arguments for that. I get that. I mean, the Senators, yes, they're a new team, but that team but they also had a team in the early 1900s. So that discussion all of a sudden becomes a thing. You can make the Winnipeg argument. You could probably make the Vancouver argument. I mean, you
can make the Seattle Metropolitans argument.
Exactly. Like there's plenty of discussions that you could have with this topic. It's completely subjective, and like I said, just because it's Canada and hockey, all of a sudden all of those teams get put into the conversation.
Yeah. So like we said, it is a very, very personalized grouping.
Open-ended.
So we want to hear your answers. Let us know. Twitter, Ice-Burgh Podcast. Facebook, Tip of the Ice-Burgh Podcast. Instagram, Tip of the Ice-Burgh Podcast. Or you can go to Inside the Penguins on YouTube. Leave a comment under this video. Let us know who your Blue Bloods are for the National Hockey League. Or again, anywhere you get your podcast from, you can write a review if possible. Add a 5-star rating on that, and we'll call it a day. But we'll talk about those on Thursday if you submit them, right? If you don't submit them, we're not going to talk about it again. But if you want to submit them, we will talk about it. We'll mention it. Add any teams that we haven't listened. Like, did we ignore a team that you want to call a Blue Blood? Maybe St. Louis, even though that's a team that's interesting. They're right above my shoulder there because they're second 6, right? So we'll have to have that discussion if you guys want to continue it. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. We'll see you guys next time.